Hello there, and welcome to this quiet corner where time moves slowly and wonder is allowed to unfold without hurry. Tonight, we're not staying in the present. We're stepping far back into a world so ancient that even the ground beneath our feet would be unrecognizable. This is a journey into deep time, into an Earth that existed when all the land on our planet was gathered into a single, unimaginable mass called Pangea. Picture this for a moment. If you could somehow stand on that ancient supercontinent and begin walking in any direction, you might start in what we now call North America and keep moving east, crossing into what would one day become Europe and Asia, without ever seeing an ocean break the horizon. You could turn south and wander through regions that would eventually split apart to form Africa and South America, all while never setting foot on a ship or crossing a single sea. There was only land, stretching farther than any traveller could hope to walk in a lifetime, surrounded by one immense ocean that wrapped around it like a ring. What would it have felt like to breathe that air, to look up at a sky unmarked by the familiar boundaries we know today, to witness ecosystems and creatures so strange they would seem like visitors from another world entirely? This is the story of Pangea, not just as a geological curiosity, but as a living, breathing world where life unfolded under conditions almost impossible for us to imagine. Tonight, we'll walk together through this ancient landscape, slowly and without rushing, noticing the details that paint a picture of our planet as it once was. We'll meet the creatures that roamed its vast interior deserts and humid coastal forests. We'll feel the rhythm of its unprecedented monsoon systems and witness the emergence of the very first dinosaurs. And perhaps most remarkably, we'll discover how this single, unified world shaped the trajectory of life in ways that still echo through every ecosystem on Earth today. Before we begin our journey proper, I'd love to know where you are in the world right now as you listen to this. What time is it? Are you settling in for the night, or perhaps letting your mind wander during a quiet afternoon? There's something beautifully ironic about the fact that as we explore this ancient unified Earth, here we are, separated by the very oceans that didn't exist back then, yet connected by this shared moment of curiosity and wonder. If this kind of slow exploration through deep time appeals to you, I'd be grateful if you let this channel know by subscribing or leaving a gentle like. It helps this quiet signal reach other minds that appreciate taking their time with big questions. But there's no pressure, of course, just an invitation, like the faint trail we're about to follow back through hundreds of millions of years. To understand what life was like on Pangea, we first need to appreciate just how extraordinary this supercontinent truly was. Imagine trying to explain to someone today that there was once a time when you could theoretically walk from the Arctic to Antarctica without ever crossing water deeper than a river or lake. When the entire surface of our planet was dominated not by 7 separate continents, but by one colossal landmass that stretched from pole to pole. Pangea wasn't built in a day or even in a million days. Its formation was a slow dance of continental drift that unfolded over hundreds of millions of years, beginning around 335 million years ago during the Carboniferous period. Picture the Earth's crust as a vast, slow-moving puzzle, with pieces drifting across the planet's surface at speeds measured in centimeters per year. These weren't random movements, but part of a grand choreography driven by the heat and convection currents deep within our planet's interior. The supercontinent we call Pangea was actually the culmination of several smaller continental collisions. Ancient land masses called Gondwana, Euramerica, and Siberia gradually converged like cosmic dancers moving toward a final embrace. Each collision was a mountain-building event of thrust crumpled and folded, pushing enormous mountain ranges toward the sky, some unimaginable scale. Where these continental masses met, the sea of these ancient mountain chains still exists today. their worn-down remnants scattered across continents, now separated by thousands of kilometers of ocean. What strikes me most about this process is its patience. The forces that built Pangea worked with a kind of geological persistence that makes human timeframes seem like brief flickers. Mountain ranges rose grain by grain. Ocean basins slowly closed as continents crept toward each other. And through it all, life continued, adapting to landscapes that were constantly, imperceptibly changing. The shape of Pangea itself was distinctive, often described as C-shaped when viewed from above. This wasn't a perfect circle or rectangle of land, but something more organic, more flowing. The bulk of the supercontinent stretched between Earth's northern and southern polar regions, with a large indentation on its eastern side where the Tethys Ocean carved a deep bay into the landmass. This configuration would prove crucial for the climate patterns and life forms that would call Pangea home. Surrounding this vast continent was Panthalassa, literally meaning all ocean. This was the largest single body of water in Earth's history, covering roughly 3/4 of the planet's surface. Imagine standing on Pangea's western shore and looking out across an ocean so vast that it made the Pacific seem like a lake in comparison. The scale is almost incomprehensible. Ships sailing west from Pangea's edge would have travelled for thousands upon thousands of kilometres without encountering any land at all. The climate of Pangea was shaped by its extraordinary size and configuration in ways that created conditions unlike anything our modern world has ever experienced. When nearly all of Earth's land is gathered into a single mass, the normal moderating influence of oceans largely disappears from the interior regions. What emerged was a world of extremes, where the difference between coast and interior, between season and season, was amplified beyond our modern experience. Let's start with what scientists call the megamonsoon, a weather system so vast and powerful that it makes today's Asian monsoons look gentle by comparison. The physics behind this system were elegant in their simplicity, yet staggering in their consequences. During Pangea's summer months, the vast interior of the supercontinent would heat up dramatically under the relentless sun. This created an enormous low-pressure system that drew moisture-laden air inland from the surrounding Panthalassa Ocean with incredible force. The result was seasonal rainfall patterns that could transform entire regions from desert to swamp and back again within the span of months. Paleoclimatologists have found evidence that these monsoon rains were so intense they could support lush tropical forests in regions that, during the dry season, resembled the most arid deserts on Earth today. Tree rings fossilized from this era show the dramatic growth patterns you'd expect from plants that had to endure both feast and famine on a scale we can barely imagine. But it wasn't just the monsoons that made Pangea's climate extraordinary. The sheer distance from ocean to interior created temperature variations that dwarf anything we experience today. Computer models suggest that summer temperatures in Pangea's heart could have reached 45 degrees Celsius or higher, while winter temperatures might have plunged far below freezing. These weren't just uncomfortable conditions, they were climate extremes that fundamentally shaped which forms of life could survive and where. The coastal regions told a different story entirely. Here, the moderating influence of Panthalassa created conditions that were often lush and tropical. Fossil evidence shows that much of equatorial Pangea was covered in dense forests of seed ferns and early conifers. Coal deposits found across multiple modern continents provide evidence of these ancient tropical forests, their remains compressed over millions of years into the fossil fuels we extract today. What fascinates me about Pangea's climate is how its coastal plains might as well have been on a different planet from Mars. A creature living on the Humi created what was essentially multiple worlds, within a single lane, one adapted to the harsh interior deserts. And yet, unlike today's Earth, where oceans provide clear barriers between different climate zones, Pangea's animals and plants could potentially migrate across these dramatically different environments. This created evolutionary pressures and opportunities unlike anything in Earth's history before or since. The atmospheric composition during Pangea's existence was also dramatically different from today's. Oxygen levels fluctuated significantly throughout this period, at times reaching concentrations much higher than our current 21%. These elevated oxygen levels had profound effects on life, allowing some organisms to grow to sizes that would be impossible in today's atmosphere. We'll meet some of these giants soon, but for now, just imagine breathing air so rich in oxygen that it could support insects with wingspans measured in feet rather than inches. While Pangea dominated the land, the ocean that surrounded it was equally remarkable in its own right. Panthalassa wasn't just large, it was an entirely different kind of ocean system than anything we see today. With no other major land masses to interrupt its circulation patterns, this global ocean developed current systems of unprecedented scale and consistency. The marine life in Panthalassa faced unique challenges and opportunities. In the shallow coastal waters around Pangea's periphery, where sunlight could penetrate to the seafloor and nutrients washed down from the continent, complex reef ecosystems flourished. These weren't the coral reefs we know today, but earlier versions dominated by different organisms entirely. Massive sponges and rugose corals created underwater forests, while early brachiopods and crinoids carpeted the seafloor like living meadows. Swimming through these ancient seas were creatures that would seem both familiar and alien to modern eyes. Ammonites, relatives of today's nautiluses, had evolved into hundreds of different species, each with shells coiled in distinctive patterns that paleontologists use today, like fingerprints to date rock layers. Some of these cephalopods grew to enormous sizes, their shells measuring several feet across, making them apex predators of the shallow seas. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Panthalassa was its sheer emptiness. The deep ocean, far from Pangea's shores, was a vast blue desert where life was sparse and specialized. Without the complex system of ocean basins and currents that characterize today's seas, nutrients and oxygen were distributed differently, creating marine ecosystems unlike anything in our modern oceans. The Tethys Ocean, which formed as a large bay indenting Pangea's eastern coast, played a crucial role in the supercontinent's climate and marine ecosystems. This smaller sea acted as a crucial source of moisture for the monsoon systems that dominated Pangea's weather patterns. Its warm, shallow waters were like a massive evaporator, feeding water vapor into the atmosphere that would later fall as the torrential monsoon rains that shaped life across the supercontinent. As we stand here on the shores of this ancient world, looking out across waters that stretch to every horizon, it's worth pausing to consider what we're really witnessing. This isn't just a different arrangement of familiar elements. This is a fundamentally different kind of planet, one where the very rules of climate, geography, and life operated according to principles we can study but never truly experience. The story of Pangea is also the story of life adapting to extremes, of evolution pushed to its limits by conditions that tested every possible strategy for survival. And it's in this crucible of heat, drought, flood, and seasonal extremes that some of the most important chapters in the history of life on Earth were written. In our next exploration, we'll meet the remarkable creatures that called this ancient world home. From the massive amphibians that ruled the rivers to the first tentative dinosaurs that would eventually inherit the Earth. But for now, let the image settle in your mind. One vast continent under one vast sky, surrounded by one endless ocean, all of it pulsing with the rhythm of seasons more extreme than any our modern world has ever known. The stage is set, the world of Pangea awaits, and the story of life in this ancient realm is just beginning to unfold. Something extraordinary happened at the boundary between Pangea's early history and its mature years, something so catastrophic that it reshaped the entire trajectory of life on Earth. Around 252 million years ago, As the supercontinent reached its full assembly, the planet experienced what scientists now call the Permian Triassic extinction event. But perhaps a more fitting name would be the Great Dying, for this was extinction on a scale almost impossible to comprehend. Picture this. In the space of perhaps a few 100,000 years, which is but a moment in geological time, roughly 96% of all marine species and 70% of all terrestrial life simply vanished from the fossil record. Entire ecosystems that had flourished for millions of years were wiped clean, leaving behind only the faintest traces in stone. The very air itself became toxic as massive volcanic eruptions in what we now call Siberia poured greenhouse gases and sulfur compounds into the atmosphere on a scale that dwarfed anything in recorded history. The cause of this great catastrophe was intimately connected to Pangea itself. As the supercontinent reached its maximum size, the stresses within Earth's crust triggered volcanic activity of unprecedented magnitude. These weren't isolated eruptions, but a sustained period of volcanism that lasted for thousands of years, releasing enough lava to cover an area larger than modern Europe. The atmospheric changes that followed created a cascade of environmental disasters: acid rain, global warming, ocean acidification, and the breakdown of the ozone layer. And yet, life endured. Not all of it, certainly not most of it, but enough to begin again. In the aftermath of the Great Dying, Pangea became a world of survivors, and among these survivors were the ancestors of creatures that would one day rule the Earth. The story of recovery is, in many ways, more remarkable than the story of extinction itself. One survivor stands out above all others, not for its size or ferocity, but for its remarkable ability to adapt and spread. Lystrosaurus was a pig-sized herbivore with a distinctive beak and two small tusks, part of the group we call synapsids, the distant ancestors of mammals. What made Lystrosaurus extraordinary wasn't its appearance, but its success. In the years immediately following the Great Dying, this unassuming creature comprised up to 90% of all terrestrial vertebrate life in some regions. Fossils of Lystrosaurus have been found across what were once widely separated parts of Pangea, from South Africa to Antarctica to China. This global distribution provides some of the strongest evidence we have for the supercontinent's existence, because these creatures were poor swimmers and could never have crossed ocean barriers. Their presence on continents now separated by thousands of kilometers of ocean tells us that these lands were once connected, part of a single, vast world where a determined herbivore could theoretically walk from one end to the other. But Lystrosaurus was not alone in its success. The post-extinction world of Pangea became a testing ground for new forms of life, evolutionary experiments that would shape the future of the planet. Among the synapsids, the group that included Lystrosaurus, new lineages were emerging that showed increasingly mammal-like characteristics. These therapsids, as we call them, developed more efficient jaw muscles, differentiated teeth for cutting and grinding, and some even show evidence of whiskers in their fossilized skulls, suggesting they may have been among the first creatures to develop fur and warm-bloodedness. While would become one of the most successful evolutionary radiations in Earth's history, the arch post-extinction world, another group was quietly preparing for what the mammal ancestors were finding their footing in Pangeosaurs, a group that would eventually give rise to crocodiles, pterosaurs, and dinosaurs, began their rise to dominance in the harsh seasonal climate of the Triassic period. The early archosaurs were not yet the giants we associate with the age of dinosaurs. They were often small, agile creatures, well adapted to the extreme climate variations that characterized Pangea's interior. Some were bipedal, running swiftly across the arid landscapes on powerful hind legs. Others remained quadrupedal, but developed new adaptations for dealing with the seasonal extremes of drought and flood that defined life on the supercontinent. It was around 230 million years ago that the first true dinosaurs appeared in Pangea's fossil record, and they were nothing like the massive creatures that would later capture our imagination. These early dinosaurs were typically small, perhaps the size of a large dog, with long tails and sharp dentars in a world still recovering ecological niches as swift preclaws. They were primarily carnivorous, filling from the Great Extinction. What gave these early dinosaurs their evolutionary edge was their remarkable adaptability to Pangea's extreme climate conditions. Their upright posture allowed them to move efficiently across long distances, following seasonal rains and migrating with the food sources that appeared and disappeared with Pangea's dramatic weather patterns. Their relatively small size meant they needed less food and water than larger competitors, a crucial advantage in a world where resources could be scarce for months at a time. The success of early dinosaurs was also tied to Pangea's unique geography. Land bridges connected regions that today are separated by vast oceans, allowing these creatures to spread rapidly across the supercontinent. A species that evolved in what we now call Argentina could potentially migrate all the way to what would become Europe or Asia, following river valleys and coastal plains that no longer exist. This connectivity had profound implications for evolution itself. Instead of the isolated populations that characterize much of modern evolution, Pangea allowed for gene flow across continental scales. Species could spread rapidly, adapt to new environments, and hybridize with distant populations in ways that would be impossible in today's fragmented world. As we wander deeper into Pangea's ancient landscapes, we encounter forests unlike any that exist today. These weren't the flowering woodlands we know, for flowering plants hadn't yet evolved. Instead, Pangea's forests were dominated by gymnosperms, plants that reproduce through naked seeds rather than enclosed fruits and flowers. The most impressive of these were the early conifers, which grew to staggering heights in some regions. Individual trees could reach 30 meters tall or more, creating forest canopies that filtered the harsh sunlight of Pangea's intense summers. These weren't quite the conifers we know today, though they were recognizably related. Their needle-like leaves were adaptations to the seasonal extremes of Pangea's climate, designed to conserve water during the long dry seasons while still allowing photosynthesis during the brief but intense growing periods. Beneath these towering conifers, the forest floor was carpeted with seed ferns, strange plants that looked like ferns but reproduced through seeds rather than spores. Some of these grew as large as modern tree ferns, creating a multi-layered forest ecosystem that supported an incredible diversity of life. The most famous of these seed ferns was Glossopteris, whose distinctive leaves have been found fossilized across multiple continents, providing another key piece of evidence for Pangea's existence. What strikes me most about these ancient forests is their resilience. They had to endure not just the normal challenges that face any ecosystem, but the extreme seasonal variations that characterized Pangea's climate. During the monsoon seasons, some forest regions would receive more rainfall in a few months than many modern forests see in an entire year. Then, for the remainder of the year, these same forests might experience drought conditions that would challenge even desert-adapted plants. The animals that lived in these forests were equally remarkable. This was the domain of the large amphibians that still ruled many of Pangea's waterways and wetlands. Creatures like Eriops, a predator that could grow to 6 feet in length, moved through the forest streams like ancient crocodiles. These weren't the small retiring amphibians we know today, but dominant predators that filled ecological roles we now associate with reptiles and mammals. Flying through the canopy were insects of extraordinary size and diversity. The high oxygen levels that characterized much of Pangea's atmosphere allowed for gigantic arthropods that would seem monstrous by today's standards. Dragonflies with wingspans approaching a meter patrolled the forest clearings, while millipede-like creatures, several feet in length, crawled through the leaf litter, processing the constant rain of organic matter that fell from above. These forests were also the stage for one of evolution's most important experiments, the transition from amphibian dominance to reptilian success. While large amphibians still ruled the wetlands, smaller, more agile reptiles were beginning to explore the forest understory. These early reptiles had a crucial advantage over their amphibian competitors. They didn't need to return to water to reproduce. Their eggs, protected by shells and membranes, could be laid on land, freeing them from dependence on ponds and streams. But not all of Pangea was forested. Indeed, some of the most remarkable adaptations occurred in the vast desert regions that dominated the supercontinent's interior. These weren't small regional deserts like those we see today, but continental-scale arid zones that stretched for thousands of kilometers in every direction, broken only by seasonal rivers and occasional oases. The creatures that survived in these harsh environments had to be masters of water conservation and temperature regulation. Among the most successful were the early therapsids, the mammal-like reptiles that were slowly developing the physiological innovations that would eventually give rise to true mammals. These creatures developed increasingly sophisticated methods of thermoregulation, some possibly even developing the first primitive forms of fur or hair. One of the most iconic inhabitants of Pangea's deserts was Dimetrodon, often mistaken for a dinosaur, but actually a much earlier synapsid. Its most distinctive feature was the enormous sail on its back, supported by elongated vertebral spines. This sail wasn't just for show, it was a sophisticated piece of biological engineering that allowed Dimetrodon to regulate its body temperature in the extreme conditions of Pangea's interior. During the cool desert mornings, Dimetrodon could orient its sail toward the rising sun, using it like a solar collector to rapidly warm its body. During the scorching midday heat, it could angle the sail to minimize sun exposure while maximizing heat loss. This gave Dimetrodon a significant advantage over creatures that relied solely on behavioral thermoregulation, allowing it to remain active during parts of the day when other predators were forced to seek shade. The plant life in these desert regions was equally specialized. Early conifers developed waxy coatings on their needles and efficient root systems that could extract moisture from deep underground. Some developed the ability to shut down their metabolism almost completely during the harshest parts of the dry season, essentially hibernating until the next monsoon brought relief. What's remarkable about Pangea's desert ecosystems is how they connected to the more humid regions along the coasts. During the monsoon seasons, seasonal rivers would flow from the mountains and coastal plains deep into the desert interior, bringing with them nutrients, sediments, and even migrating animals. These seasonal connections created a dynamic ecosystem where desert specialists could interact with forest dwellers, leading to evolutionary pressures and opportunities that simply don't exist in today's more geographically isolated world. The fossil evidence from these ancient deserts tells stories of remarkable survival and adaptation. We find trackways preserved in what were once mudflats around seasonal lakes, showing the movements of creatures ranging from small reptiles to massive amphibians, all converging on these temporary oases during the brief wet seasons. As we prepare to explore the final chapter of Pangea's story, it's worth pausing to consider what we've witnessed. This wasn't just a different arrangement of continents and oceans. This was a fundamentally different kind of planet, one where life operated under rules and constraints that no longer exist. The extreme seasonality, the continental-scale ecosystems, the ability of species to migrate across what are now entire ocean basins, all of this created evolutionary pressures and opportunities that shaped life in ways where is also the story of resilience, of still discovering. The story of Pangea life's remarkable ability to adapt to even the most extreme conditions our planet can produce. And as we'll see in our final exploration, it was also the story of transition, the slow transformation from this unified world to the fragmented planet we know today. As we drift deeper into our exploration of Pangea's living tapestry, we encounter one of the most remarkable aspects of this ancient world: its relationship with water. Not just the vast Panthalassa ocean that embraced the supercontinent, but the intricate network of rivers, lakes, and seasonal waterways that acted as the circulatory system of this unified Earth. Imagine rivers that could flow for distances that would span multiple modern continents, carrying sediments and nutrients from mountain ranges that rose where ancient continents collided. These weren't just waterways, they were highways of life, corridors through which species could migrate across the entire breadth of Pangea. A fish species that evolved in the tropical wetlands near the equator could potentially swim upstream, following river systems that stretched thousands of kilometers into what would one day become the Arctic regions. The seasonal nature of many of these water systems created rhythms of abundance and scarcity that shaped evolution in profound ways. During the intense monsoon seasons, vast areas of Pangea's interior would transform from parched desert into sprawling wetlands teeming with life. Amphibians would emerge from underground refuges where they had waited out the dry months. Seeds that had lain dormant in the dust would suddenly sprout into carpets of vegetation. The entire landscape would pulse with renewal. But perhaps the most extraordinary inhabitants of these ancient waterways were the temnospondyls, a group of amphibians so different from their modern descendants that they seem almost alien. These were the true rulers of Pangea's aquatic realms, creatures that could grow to lengths of 4 meters or more. Picture something resembling a cross between a salamander and a crocodile, but scaled up to sizes that would dwarf any amphibian alive today. The largest of these aquatic predators moved through Pangea's rivers and lakes like living submarines, their powerful tails propelling them through the water with surprising grace despite their bulk. Their skulls, preserved in exquisite detail in fossil deposits across multiple continents, show adaptations for a lifestyle spent between land and water. Massive jaw muscles powered bites that could crush bone, while lateral line systems along their sides detected the slightest movements in the murky waters where they hunted. What strikes me most about these ancient waterways is how they connected not just different regions of Pangea, but different worlds within the supercontinent. A river might begin in the humid coastal forests, flow through seasonal wetlands where giant amphibians basked in the shallows, cross vast interior plains where early reptiles came to drink, and finally peter out in the heart deserts of the great creating oases that supported unique communities of specialized desert dwellers. These aquatic highways also served as corridors for some of the most remarkable migrations in Earth's history. Evidence suggests that some species undertook journeys that would be impossible in today's fragmented world, following seasonal rains and flooding patterns across distances that spanned what are now entire ocean basins. The fossil record preserves tantalizing glimpses of these ancient journeys, trackways that suddenly appear in rock formations thousands of kilometers from the nearest other evidence of the species, suggesting epic migrations across Pangea's vast landscapes. High above Pangea's rivers and forests, another revolution was quietly unfolding. The atmosphere itself was different during this ancient time, richer in oxygen than our modern air, and this difference had profound implications for the creatures that called the supercontinent home. In this oxygen-rich environment, arthropods could grow to sizes that would be impossible today, creating aerial ecosystems unlike anything in our modern world. The skies above Pangea were dominated by insects of extraordinary proportions. Dragonflies with wingspans approaching a meter patrolled the airspace above rivers and wetlands, their compound eyes tracking prey with the precision of modern fighter pilots. These weren't just scaled-up versions of modern dragonflies, they were apex predators of the aerial realm, capable of taking down prey much larger than the mosquitoes and flies that sustain their modern descendants. But it wasn't just their size that made these ancient flyers remarkable. The high oxygen content of Pangea's atmosphere allowed for more efficient cellular respiration, enabling these creatures to sustain flight patterns that would exhaust modern insects. Some species may have been capable of long-distance migrations, following the seasonal monsoons across vast stretches of the supercontinent, their wings carrying them over landscapes that shifted from desert to forest to wetland with the changing seasons. On the ground, the oxygen-rich environment supported arthropods of equally impressive dimensions. Millipede-like creatures stretched several feet in length, their segmented bodies undulating through the leaf litter of Pangea's forests like living trains. These gentle giants were the recyclers of their ecosystems, breaking down fallen plant matter and returning nutrients to the soil. But their sheer size gave them a presence in the ancient world that no modern invertebrate can match. The abundance of these large arthropods created opportunities for predators, and it was in this context that some of the early reptiles and synapsids began to specialize as insectivores. Small, agile hunters developed keen eyesight and quick reflexes to catch their oversized prey. Some evolved elongated snouts and specialized teeth for extracting insects from crevices in bark or from underground burrows. These seemingly minor adaptations would prove crucial as they laid the groundwork for the more complex feeding strategies that would emerge as Pangea's ecosystems continued to evolve. The relationship between atmospheric composition and life size creates a fascinating feedback loop when we consider Pangea's plant communities. The massive arthropods that thrived in the oxygen-rich environment were also incredibly efficient at processing organic matter, breaking down fallen leaves and dead wood at rates that far exceeded anything we see today. This rapid recycling of nutrients may have contributed to the explosive growth Pangea's forests, which have in turn produced even more oxygen, supporting even larger arthropods in a cycle of abundance that characterized much of the supercontinent's history. While the early dinosaurs were beginning their rise to eventual dominance and giant arthropods ruled the skies and forest floors, another group was quietly developing innovations that would prove even more revolutionary in the long run. The synapsids, those mammal-like reptiles we've already encountered, were undergoing a series of evolutionary refinements that would eventually give rise to an entirely new way of being alive on Earth. The cynodonts, as paleontologists call the most advanced of these mammal ancestors, were developing characteristics that seem almost mundane today, but were revolutionary for their time. They were among the first vertebrates to develop differentiated teeth, with sharp incisors for cutting, pointed canines for holding prey, and flat molars for grinding. This may sound simple, but it represented a fundamental shift in how vertebrates could process food, allowing them to extract more nutrition from each meal and survive on a wider variety of food sources. Even more remarkable was their development of increasingly sophisticated jaw muscles. The distinctive temporal opening in synapsid skulls, which gives the group its name, allowed for the evolution of more powerful and precise jaw movements. This wasn't just about biting harder, it was about the development of the kind of complex chewing that would eventually allow mammals to process tough plant materials and extract maximum nutrition from their food. Some of the most advanced cynodonts show evidence in their fossilized skulls of having possessed whiskers, those sensitive facial hairs that modern mammals use to navigate in darkness and detect subtle changes in their environment. The presence of whiskers implies something even more revolutionary: the development of fur. Hair and fur require a completely different approach to body temperature regulation than the simple behavioral thermoregulation used by most reptiles. This development of hair and the sophisticated thermoregulation that goes with it may have been one of the most important evolutionary innovations in Earth's history. For the first time, vertebrates were developing the ability to maintain stable body temperatures regardless of environmental conditions. This meant they could remain active during cool nights when reptiles became sluggish, and it allowed them to colonize regions of Pangea that were too cold for most other vertebrates. The social behaviour of some advanced cynodonts was equally revolutionary. Fossil evidence suggests that some species lived and hunted in organised packs, cooperating to bring down prey much larger than any individual could handle alone. These weren't the simple aggregations we sometimes see in modern reptiles, but sophisticated social structures that required communication, role differentiation, and possibly even primitive forms of culture. What's remarkable about these mammal ancestors is how they were developing these innovations quietly, in the shadow of more dramatic evolutionary experiments. While giant amphibians dominated the waterways and early archosaurs were beginning their rise to prominence, the cynodonts were perfecting the physiological and behavioural innovations that would eventually allow their descendants to survive catastrophes that would wipe out much larger and seemingly more successful groups. As we wander through Pangea's vast forests, it becomes clear that these ancient woodlands operated according to principles very different from modern ecosystems. Without flowering plants to create the complex relationships we see in today's forests, Pangea's plant communities had to develop alternative strategies for communication, reproduction, and mutual support. The seed ferns that dominated many forest ecosystems had evolved intricate relationships with the early insects that shared their environment. Unlike the specialized pollination systems that characterize modern flowering plants, these relationships were often more generalized but no less important. Insects would feed on the protein-rich pollen of seed ferns, inadvertently carrying genetic material from plant to plant as they moved through the forest canopy. But perhaps the most sophisticated plant relationships in Pangea's forests involved the early fungi. Fossil evidence suggests that many of the conifers and seed ferns had developed complex mycorrhizal relationships with underground fungal networks. These fungal partners extended the effective root systems of trees far beyond their physical roots, allowing them to share nutrients and even chemical signals across vast distances. This fungal internet, as some scientists playfully call it, may have allowed Pangea's forests to coordinate their responses to environmental challenges in ways that individual trees could never manage alone. When drought threatened one part of a forest, trees in better watered areas could share resources through the fungal network. When insect pests attacked one species, chemical warnings could spread through the underground web, allowing other trees to begin producing defensive compounds before the threat reached them. The scale of these forest networks on Pangea may have been unprecedented in Earth's history. With continuous forest cover stretching across thousands of kilometers, in some regions, the fungal networks that connected them could have formed continental-scale communication systems. A chemical signal triggered by environmental stress in what is now South America could potentially have propagated through the network to influence tree behavior in regions that would one day become Africa or Asia. These ancient forests also supported some of the most complex food webs in Pangea's history. The abundance of plant material supported vast populations of herbivorous insects, which in turn fed the growing diversity of small reptiles, early mammals, and other predators. But what made these food webs unique was their seasonal nature. The extreme monsoon cycles that characterized much of Pangea meant that forest productivity could vary dramatically from season to season, creating boom and bust cycles that required extraordinary adaptability from all participants. During the abundant monsoon seasons, when growth was rapid and food was plentiful, some species would reproduce at extraordinary rates, building up populations that could sustain them through the leaner, dry periods. Other species developed sophisticated strategies for storing energy or resources, creating the biological equivalent of savings accounts that could be drawn upon when times were hard. While we've explored much of Pangea's terrestrial wonders, the vast Panthalassa ocean that surrounded the supercontinent held secrets equally remarkable. This wasn't just a larger version of modern oceans, it was a fundamentally different kind of marine environment, shaped by circulation patterns and chemical conditions that no longer exist on Earth. The sheer size of Panthalassa created ocean currents of unprecedented scale and stability. Without other continents to disrupt their flow, these currents could circle the globe with minimal interference, creating stable climate patterns that persisted for millions of years. The western coast of Pangea would have experienced relatively consistent temperatures and weather patterns, moderated by ocean currents that had travelled uninterrupted for thousands of kilometres. But it was in the shallow seas around Pangea's margins that marine life reached its greatest diversity and complexity. These epicontinental seas, as geologists call them, were vast shallow areas where the ocean lapped against the low-lying edges of the supercontinent. Here, in waters warmed by tropical sun and rich with nutrients washed down from the land, some of the most spectacular marine ecosystems in Earth's history flourished. The reefs of this era were architectural marvels, built not by the corals we know today, but by an earlier generation of reef-building organisms. Massive tabulate and rugose corals created frameworks that supported communities of extraordinary diversity. Crinoids, those graceful relatives of starfish, formed underwater forests with their stalked bodies swaying in the currents. Brachiopods, superficially similar to modern clams but actually quite different, carpeted the seafloor in dense beds. Swimming through these ancient reefs were cephalopods that would dwarf their modern relatives. Some ammonites grew shells over 2 meters in diameter, making them among the largest invertebrate predators that have ever lived. These weren't sluggish giants, but active hunters, using jet propulsion to chase down prey with remarkable agility, despite their size. Their shells, coiled in perfect mathematical spirals, combined strength with hydrodynamic efficiency in ways that modern engineers are still trying to understand. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Panthalassa's marine ecosystems was their stability. Unlike modern oceans, which are constantly being reconfigured by the movement of continents and the opening and closing of ocean basins, Panthalassa persisted for hundreds of millions of years with relatively little change in its basic circulation patterns. This stability allowed marine ecosystems to reach levels of complexity and specialization that may never have been equaled in Earth's oceans. The deep waters of Panthalassa remain largely mysterious to us, as few fossils from the deep ocean environments have been preserved. But what evidence we do have suggests that even the deepest parts of this ancient ocean supported life, possibly including some of the earliest experiments in deep-sea gigantism that would become a recurring theme in marine evolution. As we near the end of our journey through Pangea's ancient world, we must confront one of the most dramatic aspects of life on the supercontinent: the role of fire in shaping its ecosystems. The extreme seasonal climate, with its alternating monsoons and droughts, created conditions where wildfires were not just occasional disasters, but regular, predictable events that shaped the evolution of entire ecosystems. During the dry seasons, when months passed without significant rainfall, Pangea's forests and grasslands became tinderboxes. Lightning strikes from the violent thunderstorms that often marked the transition between seasons could ignite fires that burned across thousands of square kilometers. But these weren't the catastrophic fires we often imagine when we think of wildfires. They were part of the natural rhythm of Pangea's ecosystems, as regular and important as the rains themselves. Many of Pangea's plants evolved specific adaptations to these fire cycles. Some early conifers developed thick fire-resistant bark that could protect their living tissues from all but the most intense blazes. Others evolved to reproduce immediately after fires, releasing seeds that would germinate in the ash-enriched soil left behind by the flames. Still others developed underground storage organs that could survive fires and send up new shoots once the danger had passed. The animals of Pangea had to develop their own strategies for surviving in fire-prone landscapes. Some became expert at detecting the approach of fires, using their acute senses to flee to safer areas well before the flames arrived. Others, particularly smaller species, evolved burrowing behaviours that allowed them to shelter underground until fires passed over. Some of the larger herbivores may have actually followed fires, feeding on the fresh growth that emerged from the nutrient-rich ash. These fire cycles created a unique form of ecological renewal that operated on continental scales. Areas burned during one dry season would experience explosive plant growth when the next monsoon arrived, creating temporary abundance that could support unusual concentrations of wildlife. These fire renewal cycles may have contributed to some of the rapid evolutionary changes we see in Pangea's fossil record, creating periods of intense selection pressure followed by explosive diversification. The smoke from these vast fires would have been visible from orbit had there been anyone there to see it. During peak fire seasons, much of Pangea's interior would have been shrouded in haze, creating spectacular sunsets, but also challenging conditions for the creatures that called these landscapes home. Some species may have evolved enhanced respiratory systems to cope with smoky conditions, while others developed behaviours that helped them avoid the worst of the smoke and ash. What's remarkable is how these fire-adapted ecosystems may have contributed to the evolution of some of Pangea's most successful lineages. The ability to survive in fire-prone environments required a combination of mobility, sensory acuity, and behavioural flexibility that would prove valuable in many other contexts. Some scientists speculate that the intelligence we see in later dinosaur and mammal lineages may have its roots in the cognitive demands of surviving in Pangea's fire-shaped landscapes. As we stand here at the edge of this ancient world, watching the smoke rise from distant fires, while monsoon clouds gather on the horizon, we can begin to appreciate the complexity and dynamism of life on Pangea. This wasn't a static museum piece of ancient life, but a vibrant, ever-changing world where every season brought new challenges and opportunities. The story of Pangea is ultimately a story about adaptation and resilience, about life's remarkable ability to not just survive but thrive in conditions that would challenge every assumption we might make about what's possible. And as this great supercontinent slowly began to fracture and drift apart, the lessons learned in its fire-shaped forests and monsoon-swept plains would travel with the separating land masses, influencing the evolution of life on every continent that emerged from Pangea's dissolution. But that fragmentation and the new world it would create is a story for another time. For now, let us rest here in this ancient landscape, surrounded by the sights and sounds of a world that once was, marvelling at the ingenuity of life and the patient persistence of time itself. In the quiet hours before dawn, when the world holds its breath between night and day, something profound was stirring beneath Pangea's vast landscapes. Deep within the Earth's mantle, currents of molten rock had been moving in slow, patient spirals for millions of years. And now, after eons of building pressure, these forces were beginning to express themselves in ways that would reshape not just the supercontinent, but the very nature of life itself. The first signs were subtle, barely perceptible, even across geological time. A slight widening of valleys here, a gradual sagging of lowlands there. Rivers that had flowed in the same channels for millions of years began to shift their courses as the land beneath them warped almost imperceptibly. To the creatures living through these changes, the world remained constant and familiar. But deep beneath their feet, Pangea was beginning its long goodbye. The process started along lines of weakness, ancient scars in the Earth's crust where earlier continental collisions had left the rock fractured and vulnerable. These rifts began to open like slow-motion wounds, creating valleys that would eventually become ocean basins. Magma welled up through these cracks, creating chains of volcanoes that stretched for hundreds of kilometers across what had once been continuous landscape. Picture standing on the edge of one of these early rift valleys, perhaps somewhere in what would one day become the Atlantic Ocean basin. The ground beneath your feet would have trembled occasionally with distant earthquakes, and the horizon might have glowed red at night from volcanic eruptions still too far away to pose immediate danger. But the most striking thing would have been the sense of space opening up, of the familiar world gradually expanding beyond its ancient boundaries. The climate began to change as these rifts widened and deepened. Narrow arms of the sea crept inland, bringing marine influences to regions that had been continental for hundreds of millions of years. The extreme seasonal variations that had characterized Pangea's interior began to moderate as these new water bodies provided sources of moisture and temperature buffering that had been absent for so long. For the plants and animals of Pangea, these changes created both challenges and opportunities of unprecedented scale. Species that had ranged freely across the entire supercontinent suddenly found their populations becoming isolated as rift valleys widened into narrow seas. What had once been a single, interconnected ecosystem began to fragment into separate evolutionary theatres, each developing its own unique cast of characters. The early dinosaurs, still relatively small and specialised, found themselves among the first to exploit these changing conditions. Their mobility and adaptability allowed them to cross the narrow water barriers that were beginning to divide Pangea, colonising new territories as they became available. Some lineages became isolated on particular fragments of the breaking continent, beginning the evolutionary journeys that would eventually lead to the spectacular diversity of the later Mesozoic era. But perhaps no group was more affected by Pangea's breakup than the marine life that had evolved in the stable conditions of Panthalassa. As new ocean basins opened and expanded, they created opportunities for marine organisms to colonize previously inaccessible, shallow water environments. The formation of the early Atlantic created vast new continental shelves where reef ecosystems could flourish, while the opening of other ocean basins allowed for new patterns of ocean circulation that would reshape marine environments worldwide. The forests too began to change as the supercontinent fractured. The continental-scale fungal networks that had connected plant communities across thousands of kilometers were gradually severed as water barriers expanded. Tree populations that had shared genetic material for millions of years found themselves isolated, beginning the process of genetic drift that would eventually lead to the evolution of distinct flora on different continents. What strikes me most about this great fragmentation is how it accelerated the pace of evolution itself. The isolation of populations that had previously been connected created countless natural experiments in adaptation and speciation. Each fragment of the former supercontinent became a unique laboratory where life could explore new possibilities, develop novel solutions to environmental challenges, and experiment with forms and behaviours that might never have emerged in Pangea's more homogeneous world. And so we find ourselves at the end of our journey through deep time, having walked alongside creatures and climates that existed in a world so fundamentally different from our own that it challenges every assumption we might hold about what Earth can be. We've witnessed a planet where all land was one, where seasons could transform deserts into wetlands, where giants walked among forests of seed ferns, and where the very air itself supported life on scales we can barely comprehend. The story of Pangea reminds us that our modern world, with its familiar continents and predictable patterns, is just one chapter in a much longer tale of planetary transformation. The mountains we climb today were born from the collisions that built that ancient supercontinent. The fossils we find scattered across separate continents speak of a time when such separation was impossible. Even the breath in our lungs carries echoes of those ancient atmospheres, where dragonflies soared on wings a metre wide. Perhaps most remarkably, we are the descendants of the survivors, the inheritors of innovations forged in Pangea's crucible of extremes. The mammalian warmth that keeps us alive through cold nights, the complex teeth that allow us to process diverse foods. Even our capacity for wonder itself, all trace their origins to creatures that learned to thrive in a unified world of unprecedented challenges and opportunities. As you drift towards sleep tonight, wherever you are in our fragmented modern world, remember that you carry within you the memory of Pangea, written not in conscious thought, but in the very structure of your cells, the rhythm of your breathing, the dreams that emerge when consciousness fades. We are all children of that ancient supercontinent, scattered now across the oceans that didn't exist when our earliest ancestors first drew breath. Sleep well, knowing that the story of Earth is far from over, and that somewhere in the depths of time ahead, continents may again converge, creating new worlds we cannot yet imagine. And if you're curious about what other secrets our planet might be hiding in the layers of deep time, you might find yourself wondering about an even more intriguing possibility. What if the story of intelligent life on Earth began long before we imagine, in epochs so remote that even their memory has been erased by time itself?